Well, hello, and welcome to another edition of For the Living of These Days, Black and White edition. Just raising an observation and also a call for us to pay attention. In the wake of yesterday's white mob attack on our nation's capital, however you want to define what that was, so many words bantering around, from sedition to insurrection, but it was a white mob. And aside from the idolatry to one man and the violence that it produced, I was keenly struck by how the white mob moved with freedom during the onset of the riot. They walked into the Capitol and walked out, some tear gas at the end, no arrests. What struck me was, as if that were a black protest, a protest of racism, and it was the black community. I don't know if the Capitol Police or other law enforcement would have been as cordial. And this arises out of my observation and then a portion of an article I read today from Canada TV. Jeremiah Rodriguez writes, "When it came to that gaping chasm in police reaction, many weren't shocked," he writes. "I'm hurt, disheartened, angry, but not surprised," Assistant Professor Rachelle Lynchmore, a cultural psychologist at the Department of Human Development at Connecticut College, told CTV News via email. Very few black people with any knowledge of history are surprised. Very few people of any knowledge of history are surprised right now from the black community. This goes beyond white privilege, she says. This is an ugly manifestation of white supremacy, where white people are presumed to be innocent, to be rational, to be fair, to be just, and blacks are presumed to be criminal. And in this case, specifically, Lynchmore said, white people are given a slap on the wrist for treasonous protest because they are defending white supremacy, referring to the way police were able to safely arrest Kyle Rittenhouse, who allegedly killed 2 people at a Black Lives Matter protest in Kenosha, Wisconsin in August. Our culture has continuously excused domestic terrorism as lone wolf acts, whereas black civil rights protests are framed as criminal, and blacks as inherently, racially, and culturally violent. So wrestling with that image of white protesters who did major damage and terrorized in a seditious way can walk with impunity out, and the response to black protesters, maybe in a peaceful protest, there is a higher level of alert, of high alert, and more reaction. It struck me, and I wrestled with that image. As a white man, I am confronted with my nonchalance as I watched the privilege of white people, and I watched in horror and anger and frustration over what was taking place on the screen, and horror. But I'm also confronted with how the nonchalance of the white people in how we make distinctions. Are there two justice tracks? And all that I've heard from our black community and from those working with anti-racism, that there are two tracks of justice, one white and one black. Is it my white moderate ways that allow me to watch the unfolding violence and chaos and only see the destruction of a building and not the continued double standards of two justice perspectives, one white and one black? I'll close with a portion of Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, a letter written in response to 8 white clergy leaders who felt that King needed to slow down and let authorities handle it. Even though they were against segregation, these 8 white clergy, they still had the privilege of telling King to wait. And so his letter from the Birmingham jail is produced from that request. And in his letter, after he addresses his fellow clergymen, he goes on explaining why he's in Birmingham. But more basically, I am in Birmingham because injustice is here. Just as the prophets of the 8th century BC left their villages and carried their "Thus saith the Lord" far beyond the boundaries of their hometowns, and just as the Apostle Paul left his village of Tarsus and carried the gospel of Jesus Christ to the 4 corners of the Greco-Roman world, so I am compelled to carry the gospel of freedom beyond my own hometown. Like Paul, I must constantly respond to the Macedonian call for aid. Moreover, I am cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network, mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Never again can we afford to live with the narrow provincial outsider agitator idea. Anyone who lives inside the United States can never be considered. So you deplore the demonstrations taking place in Birmingham, but your statement, I am sorry to say, fails to express a similar concern for the conditions that brought about the demonstrations. I am sure that none of you would want to rest content with the superficial kind of social analysis that deals merely with effects and does not grapple with the underlying causes. It is unfortunate that demonstrations are taking place in Birmingham, but it is even more unfortunate that the city's white power structure left the Negro community with no alternative. So let us look deeper into yesterday's actions in Washington and see the expressions of white privilege and white supremacy and how these double standards, and then how can we recognize that we are all tied together, and what affects one directly and indirectly can affect all directly. I'm just struck by those images, and I wrestle with my nonchalance to look at a situation and not see the irony of the situation of how whites protesting in a horrific way beyond peaceful protesting, and then how peaceful black protests are looked upon in our society. I want to follow Martin Luther King and his example of kind of calling out my white moderate ways, my nonchalance, and begin to look deeper and ask stronger, more uncomfortable questions, like what was explained in the article above. So I invite us into that discussion as things unfold in the coming days and months, and let us move from sympathy with our black siblings and into empathy, and begin to feel and to see through their eyes how our world treats both black and white. And that maybe we can grow into a beloved community where we are all mutually woven into one garment of destiny. So thus is my musings as we pray for our country, as we pray for all those in harm's way. We also pray for those who struggle under the oppression of racism. And let us learn to be stronger anti-racists and pay attention to the story beneath the story. Peace.